right, hello everybody. Today we're going to be talking about psychopharmacology or drug use in the brain. So, drugs fit like keys into molecular locks. Um, a ligand is any substance that binds to a receptor, and we have endogenous ligands that bind to receptors and activate a change, which could be something like opening an ion channel. An endogenous ligand is something like a neurotransmitter, right? And so if we have a receptor here on a postsynaptic cell that's normally closed, when an endogenous ligand, endogenous means from the body, or a naturally occurring molecule like a neurotransmitter binds to a receptor, there's a receptor site, and here's the neurotransmitter binding, and it opens the receptor. And so if neurotransmitter or a ligand activates the receptor, we call that an agonist, meaning it activates the receptor. There is also exogenous ligands. Those are chemicals or drugs from outside of our body that are very similar to the endogenous ligands, like a neurotransmitter. And you can see that the exogenous, or maybe a drug, let's say, binds to the same receptor and also can then open the ion channel. And so this is also a receptor agonist, as we call it. Some substances, however, bind to receptors but don't activate them. They just block them. So they don't activate the channel, even though this drug, let's say, binds to the receptor. It doesn't activate it, so it stays closed. And then the actual neurotransmitter, right, the endogenous neurotransmitter that's trying to bind can't, because this receptor is blocked. And therefore, these kinds of blocking drugs are called antagonists. It blocks the receptor. So today we'll be talking about psychoactive drugs. A drug is a substance that changes the body or its functioning in some way, and drugs can either facilitate or inhibit activity, typically happening at the synapse, but we'll see drugs can affect the neurons in many ways. And as we said, an agonist is a kind of drug that mimics or enhances the effect of a neurotransmitter, whereas an antagonist is a drug that blocks the effect of a neurotransmitter. And psychoactive drugs are drugs that have psychological effects. So there are all sorts of drugs that don't have psychological effects, right? You could take aspirin or something for an upset stomach. Those are all drugs that change the body and its functioning in some way. But psychoactive drugs, the one we'll be interested in this class, have a psychological effect. They reduce anxiety, they increase the activity of the central nervous system, something like that. And each transmitter interacts with a variety of different receptor subtypes. So some serotonin receptors are inhibitory, some are excitatory, some are ionotropic. We talked about this. Some are metabotropic. And they differ within their distribution in the brain. So we've got neurotransmitters interacting with many different types of receptors and causing different behavioral or cognitive consequences depending on where in the brain we're talking about. In terms of at the synapse, a drug's effect depends on the dose, where it binds, and what it does. So a drug has an affinity for a particular type of receptor if it binds to that receptor. And the binding affinity is the degree of chemical attraction between a ligand and a receptor. So just because a ligand can fit into a receptor, some are more strongly attracted to that receptor and some less so and are less likely to bind. This is the binding affinity. And efficacy of a drug is its tendency to activate the receptor. So efficacy or intrinsic activity is the ability of a bound ligand to activate the receptor, and this can also vary from strong to weak. So drugs can have a high affinity, meaning they're very attracted to the receptor and they will bind, but they might not be very effective, have a low efficacy. They may still not activate that channel or activate that receptor in a very strong way. And this dose response curve is a graph of the relationship between drug doses and the effects. You can see we've got drug dose and the effect here being studied, and then you are looking at the dose at which the drug shows half of its maximal effect. That's the effective dose at 50%, right here where you're at half of its maximal effect. And one of the really important things to think about, particularly when we're talking about drugs that we're using for treatment, is the therapeutic index. This is the separation between the useful doses of the drug and the dangerous doses of the drug that could cause sickness or death. And so when these curves are farther apart, you can see here that you've got quite a big range between therapeutic doses before you get to a toxic dose. And so this is something like an example of lorazepam here. That's an anti-anxiety drug. And so because we've got this wide therapeutic index, people can take a low dose or a relatively high dose, and it's still not very dangerous. That's particularly helpful when we're talking about medications. Whereas if you have these curves much closer together, this narrow therapeutic index for, let's say, phenobarbital, there's only this narrow dosage which is therapeutic and not harmful. And once you surpass that dosage, now you're talking about the drug being dangerous and perhaps causing death. And so when you've got this narrow therapeutic index, you can see here that many deaths have resulted from phenobarbital increase because it just takes a little bit of a higher dose than what's therapeutic to be dangerous. Whereas for a drug with a much wider therapeutic index, you can take perhaps more of the dose without it being considered toxic or perhaps lethal. So drugs fit like keys into molecular locks. The amount of drug that is bioavailable or free to act on the target varies with the route of administration. So depending on how the drug is taken, depends on how much of the drug is available to be bound to receptors, or how basically effective and quickly the effects of a drug are. So the duration of a drug's effect is determined also by how it is metabolized. Biotransformation produces active metabolites that may produce side effects of the drugs. And we've already talked about the blood-brain barrier. This is the tight junction between cells of the blood vessels in the central nervous system that prevent the movement of large molecules and can limit drug availability in the brain. So those are some terms here, but you can also look and see, depending on how a drug is taken, like if you ingest it, you eat it, or swallow it, a tablet, some kind of medication in a syrup, that's a pretty slow effect. It's a slow way to get the drug into the body. Inhalation, something like smoking, snorting, gases, that's pretty moderate to fast. Peripheral injection, so an injection intramuscularly, subcutaneously, again, that's moderate to fast. And then a central injection injected right into the ventricular system, into the cerebrospinal fluid, that is a very, very fast way to get the effect of the drug. Typically, the quicker the effect of the drug, potentially the more, when we're talking about not drugs for for treatment, but drugs of addiction or abuse, the quicker the effect, the higher the potential for addiction. In terms of tolerance, you might have heard that term. This is the idea that with repeated drug use, you may get a drug tolerance. That's reduced efficacy of the drug. That when someone's experiencing tolerance, they require more of the drug to get the same effect. And so you can see here, you take the drug, develop a tolerance, then you need to take more of the drug to get the same effect. Continue to develop a tolerance, and this cycle repeats, and so people end up needing to take much, much higher doses of the drug to get the same effect that they once did. The nervous system basically adapts to having the drug in the body, and your body is trying to stay at kind of a normal or a typical level, homeostasis we call it, and if your body starts to realize, hey, someone's constantly getting this drug in my body, well, it's going to change or adapt to having the drug, and so you'll end up needing more. Tolerance might lead to overdose because some of the effects of the drug develop a tolerance and others don't. So people take more and more heroin. Heroin develops a tolerance to achieve that positive mood, which is what that positive feeling that they're looking for, but the tendency for heroin to produce sleep and respiratory arrest don't develop a tolerance. So therefore, as people take more of the drug to achieve that positive mood, they're also more likely to have respiratory arrest and perhaps overdose. So how does tolerance work? Metabolic tolerance, these are organ systems that become more effective at eliminating the drug, just getting it out of your body because it's your body saying, hey, this drug isn't supposed to be here. I know I'm getting a lot of it and I can metabolize it and get rid of it quickly. Functional tolerance, this is when the target tissue alters its sensitivity to the drug by changing the number of receptors, and it can either be done by upregulation. I'm just going to go down here to upregulation to be here in this photo. This is a response to an antagonist where the neuron actually produces more receptors. So if you're taking, someone's taking a drug that's a antagonist that's blocking the receptors, well, eventually the neurons will actually produce more receptors and say, well, if some of these receptors are being blocked by this antagonist, I am going to create more receptors, so there's more of a chance for the neurotransmitter to bind. Or downregulation in response to an agonist, if there's a drug that's binding quite a bit to these receptors, kind of overstimulating, and the body starts to realize, hey, I'm being overstimulated, there's too much of this drug around, and so it actually starts to get rid of the receptors, so there's less binding occurring. Cross tolerance is the tolerance to one drug that's generalized to other drugs in its class. So drugs affect each stage of neural conduction and synaptic transmission. Drugs can alter the presynaptic neuron in many ways by transmitter production. They may block the synthesis of enzymes or axonal support of raw materials or the ability to store a neurotransmitter. Drugs can also affect transmitter release, that they can block action potentials by blocking ion channels, and therefore the neurotransmitter can't be released into the synapse. Autoreceptors, that's a feedback system on the neuron which regulates how much neurotransmitter is released. And if these autoreceptors are blocked by the drug, then it can trick the cell into releasing more neurotransmitter. The autoreceptors saying, I guess I'm not releasing anything because I'm not getting any feedback, even though it is being blocked by the drug, and so the cell starts to release more neurotransmitter. Or if the autoreceptor is stimulated by a drug instead of by the natural process, then that autoreceptor can stop the cell from releasing neurotransmitter. And we can also see drugs affecting transmitter clearance, meaning that a drug can block the reuptake of transmitter or block enzymes leaving that would then leave the drug in the synapse longer. So here we are in the kind of presynaptic cell, that we could have inhibition of transmitter synthesis, that there's not enough neurotransmitter being synthesized due to a drug, or to blocked axonal transport, that the drug is affecting the transport of the neurotransmitter down into the cell terminal, or it could interfere with storing the neurotransmitter in the vesicles in some way. In terms of transmitter release, prevention of synaptic transmission in some way, altering transmitter release, in either releasing more or releasing less of the neurotransmitter into the synapse. And then transmitter clearance is when we're talking about in the synapse, we have the process of reuptake, that once the neurotransmitter is released into the synapse, remember there's this kind of recycling process where the neurotransmitter is brought back into the presynaptic cell to kind of clear out the synapse. Well, if that process of reuptake is blocked by the drug, then you end up having more neurotransmitter in the synapse for longer, and there's more chance of activating these receptors on the postsynaptic cell. Or another way that neurotransmitters are cleared out of the synapse is with degradation. We have some enzymes that degrade or break apart the neurotransmitters. And again, if the drug that is being taken blocks those enzymes so the neurotransmitter can't be broken apart, then again, more of this active neurotransmitter stays in the synapse and has a higher chance of activating the receptors on the postsynaptic cell. And then we also have postsynaptics effects of drugs. In terms of the postsynaptic cell, we have receptor antagonists that can block receptors from being activated. Receptor agonists that bind to receptors and activate them when, again, this is non-natural, not from the body, but from an external substance. And then these drugs can also alter intracellular processes by those up or down regulation processes we talked about. They can activate second messenger systems and activate genes in more complicated ways. So drugs can really affect all the stages of synaptic transmission. Now, addiction is a psychological disorder. So the idea of addiction is the preoccupation with obtaining a drug, compulsive use of the drug in spite of adverse consequences. So in spite of perhaps losing a job or not doing well at school or fighting with a significant other, they still have a compulsive use of the drug and a high tendency to relapse after quitting. When we talk about a biological addiction, a person must show tolerance, requiring increasing amounts of the drug, right? We said the nervous system adapts to having the drug, and we talked about the fact that tolerance may lead to overdose. So we have to see tolerance for a biological addiction and withdrawal. Withdrawal is basically the biological phenomenon that leads to cravings for the drug that some people find irresistible. And the withdrawal syndrome for a drug is typically the opposite of the drug's effect. So heroin typically makes people relax, constipated, the chills, and a positive mood. When someone stops taking heroin and is going through withdrawals, you usually see the opposite effect. So now they're agitated, they have diarrhea, fever, and depression. And these symptoms of withdrawal are very often so uncomfortable that people, again, go back to using the drug to avoid the withdrawal symptoms. And psychological addiction, people believing they need the drug to get through the day. So we're going to talk about some different categories of drugs and how they work and their effects. We'll start with opiates, which are derived from the opium poppy. This is like morphine, heroin, methadone. Opium contains morphine, which is a very effective analgesic, which is pain relief, hypnotic, it's sleep-inducing, and people feel euphoric or ecstasy, very good feelings. Um, Morphine and heroin are related, and they're both highly, highly addictive. They're one of the most addictive drugs due to the very intense and fast effect. People say it is this amazingly strong, positive, orgasm-like sensation that occurs within seconds, and then they feel relaxed and very content. Heroin is fat soluble. It enters the bloodstream fast, moves to the brain fast, and passes the blood-brain barrier easily. And opiates bind to opioid receptors in the brain, especially in an area called the periaqueductal gray. Major danger of opiates is from overdose due to tolerance because the user unknowingly takes a much purer form than usual, right? Not getting this at pharmacy, and so maybe they're taking a much stronger dose than typical, and that can lead to overdose. This is just an interesting study. No need to remember these numbers, but this was a 33-year study of 581 male heroin addicts. What they found after those 33 years was that 49% of the participants in the study were dead at the end of the study, and the average age of death was 46 years old. 25% died of an overdose, 20% homicide, suicide, or accident, 15% died of liver disease, and 50% of the survivors were still using heroin. It just shows that this is a very, very dangerous drug. Condition tolerance also develops with opiates, and there's a tolerance associated with the person's drug-taking surroundings. So eventually, just the act of taking the drug and all of the kind of the environment associated with the person's drug-taking behavior, if they usually take the drug in a particular room or if they have particular I don't know, paraphernalia with them, all they have to do is be in that room or see that paraphernalia, and their body triggers basically an anticipatory response. It knows the body knows it's about to get this drug, and it secretes drug antagonists that help eliminate the drug from the body. And so it's like your body almost prepares and says, oh, I know I'm going to be getting this drug. I'm going to prepare myself by kind of getting ready to get this drug out of my body and producing these antagonists. But if someone then takes the drug in a different location, and so the body isn't prepared, it's not producing those antagonists, that may lead to overdose. So the amount of heroin that killed 32% of rats in their customary environment killed double that when they took the same amount of drug in a different location, meaning the body wasn't able to, it had this condition tolerance, but it wasn't able to prepare for the large amount of the drug that it was going to receive, and so unfortunately led to overdose. The brain produces peptides called endorphins. So these are endogenous ligands. These are natural chemicals from the body. Endogenous opioids are produced in the brain, and they attach to the same receptors that the opioids attach to. Endorphins inhibit GABA, which indirectly release dopamine. There are three kinds of opioid receptors, delta, kappa, and mu. All are metabotropic receptors. And drugs that block opioid receptors can reverse the effect of opiates. All right, now we'll talk about cannabis or marijuana. These are the dried leaves of the hemp plant. THC is the major psychoactive ingredient. The effects vary from relaxation, mood alteration, stimulation, paranoia. Heavy use can cause respiratory problems, addiction, and cognitive decline. Adolescents who use marijuana may have an increased risk of developing schizophrenia. THC, interestingly, attaches to receptors in the brain, cannabinoid receptors in the brain. These are actual receptors, which makes you think, well, if there are receptors in the brain for this exogenous substance, must there be something in that our body produces that would bind to these receptors? And in fact, there are endogenous chemicals. Anandamide is probably the most studied that attach to these same receptors. Anandamide as well as THC, when they bind to the cannabinoid receptors, increase dopamine levels. THC inhibits the release of glutamate and GABA. We've got receptors, these cannabinoid receptors in the frontal cortex, which may account for impaired cognitive functioning and distortions of time because the frontal lobe is important for cognitive functioning. There are also these receptors in the hippocampus. Hippocampus is important for memory, and so it might make sense that there are memory disruptions when someone is using marijuana. And there are receptors in the basal ganglia and cerebellum that might be responsible for the impaired movement and coordination that we see when people are using marijuana. Research aims to develop drugs with beneficial effects of marijuana, such as pain relief and lowering blood pressure. So we're working on that. In terms of cannabis, it's found that young adults who smoked 5 or more joints per week lost an average of 4 points in IQ from childhood. There's kind of this question of, is marijuana bad for you? Is it addictive? Well, here we go with kind of heavy marijuana use and the loss of 4 IQ points. I guess we could have a discussion about how, is that dangerous? Is that really something to be worried about? Whereas other people would think every IQ point should be important. Is marijuana addictive? It was previously not thought of as addictive because there isn't a real withdrawal symptom or syndrome if people stop using marijuana. The withdrawal is mild because THC is fat soluble, leaves the body very slowly. However, we know that monkeys will press a lever to inject THC. So if they have the opportunity, monkeys will sit there and press that lever to get this injection of THC, which really looks like addiction. And people certainly show compulsive use. They try to get the drug even if they're experiencing negative consequences. Here's just brain areas that are have some of these cannabinoid receptors, the hippocampus, part of the motor system here in the cerebellum. Okay, stimulants. Stimulants are drugs that increase nervous system activity by increasing excitatory input or decreasing inhibitory input. Let's see here. I'm going to just go over here. Stimulants and drugs can be almost anything. I gotta love that picture, right? That poor cat. I gotta cut back on caffeine. Caffeine is a stimulant. It's a drug, so we don't often think of it that way, but it is. It causes arousal, alertness, decreased sleepiness. When someone ingests caffeine, there's an increased release of dopamine. And there is a withdrawal syndrome. In fact, some of you might have experienced this if you typically drink caffeine, drink coffee, and then say, I'm going to try to go without caffeine for a little while. How do you feel the next few days? Often get headaches, fatigued, anxious, shaky, you have this craving, and very often we go back to drinking our coffee after we try that for a little while. A caffeine withdrawal is not a big problem, or a caffeine addiction is not a very big problem because caffeine is quite plentiful in our country, right? There's a Starbucks on every corner, if not many coffee shops per corner. It's interesting, the Mayo Clinic researchers actually saw that caffeine addiction was such a significant problem because if you go in for surgery, You can't eat, you can't drink, going for surgery. And then as people are healing, not only are they dealing with healing from the surgery, but they have to deal with caffeine withdrawal because most people are somewhat caffeine addicted in our society. And so the Mayo Clinic researchers actually suggested maybe we should have an intravenous administration of caffeine to patients recovering from surgery so they don't have to deal with caffeine withdrawal along with recovering from surgery. Just goes to show what something that we don't think of perhaps as, you know, such a big deal. Caffeine can be addictive and has a real impact on our bodies and our mood. Tobacco is another stimulant. Nicotine from tobacco acts as a stimulant. It increases heart rate, blood pressure, digestive action, alertness. Smoked in short puffs, there's a stimulating effect. If you really inhale nicotine deeply, you can even get a tranquilizing or depressant effect. There is a pretty prominent withdrawal when people stop using nicotine, with anxiety, drowsiness, lightheadedness, and headaches. The health risks of tobacco are high. People can have breathing difficulty, coughing, pneumonia, bronchitis, emphysema, cancers, etc. However, tobacco and nicotine is highly addictive. These are just some interesting facts showing how addictive this is. Only 20% of quitting attempts are successful after 2 years. Before bans on smoking, 80% of male smokers, 66% of female smokers smoked at least one cigarette per waking hour. It's a lot of cigarettes. And Freud, right, the father of psychology, continued to smoke even after mouth and jaw cancer and replacement of his jaw with an artificial one. So this is a very addictive drug. Nicotine stimulates nicotinic acetylcholine receptors, acts as an agonist on these nicotinic acetylcholine receptors in the cortex, enhancing some cognitive functions, and in the ventral tegmental area, activating reward and addiction pathways. We're going to talk about reward and addiction in a few more slides. Cocaine is also a stimulant. It was actually used in foods and as an anesthetic, but is highly addictive and has serious side effects. Cocaine is made from the cocoa plant. It's a white powder that's snorted or mixed with water and injected. It produces euphoria, decreased appetite, increased alertness. Pure cocaine is smoked and enters the bloodstream rapidly. Crack is similar but less pure. Cocaine works by blocking the reuptake of neurotransmitters, so they accumulate in the synapses throughout the brain and boost their effects. So cocaine works by blocking that reuptake process, leaving neurotransmitters in the synapse longer, and then having them continue to act longer than they should in the synapse. Injection and smoking lead to immediate and intense euphoria, which again increases the addictive potential because the effects are so fast and so intense. After a cocaine binge, the user crashes into depression, anxiety, and a craving that motivates continued use. The withdrawal is relatively mild, but the intense high makes it very, very addictive. 90% of rats allowed to self-administer cocaine died compared to 36% receiving heroin. So it is a dangerous drug. And you can see that cocaine acts in different areas of the brain, again, because it blocks the reuptake and causes an accumulation of dopamine and other norepinephrine in these synapses. Amphetamine, another stimulant, synthetic drugs, and can be in a pure form ice that is smoked. Euphoria leads to euphoria and increased confidence and concentration, reduces appetite, increases alertness, can be used in treating narcolepsy. Heavy use of amphetamines can cause hallucinations and delusions that resemble paranoid schizophrenia. Synthetic stimulants like amphetamine have a two-step mode of action on dopamine. It increases the release of dopamine and norepinephrine. Amphetamines cause a larger than normal release of neurotransmitter at the axon terminals, and amphetamines interfere with the breakdown of the neurotransmitter in the synapse. So you basically have more neurotransmitter being released, and then it's not being broken down in the synapse. Prolonged use lead to symptoms that resemble schizophrenia or brain damage. Alcohol is interesting in that as a drug, can act as a stimulant as well as a depressant. It's the most common and most abused depressant. It's the oldest of the abused drugs. Phil even found that elephants will eat fermented fruit until they become intoxicated. So this really is a widely used drug of abuse from fermented fruits, grains, and other plant products. Also, alcohol plays a role in many religious or cultural events, so it's quite used and used in many ceremonies and things like that. Alcohol produces euphoria, anxiety reduction, sedation, motor incoordination, and cognitive impairment. Alcohol's effects are biphasic, meaning there's an initial stimulant phase followed by a depressant phase. So that's where it's a stimulant and a depressant. At low doses, alcohol is a stimulant. So when somebody first starts drinking, they might get more energy, kind of more awake. But then at higher doses, it becomes a sedative and people become very relaxed to this almost, or can be to the state of being unconscious. And so after someone's finished drinking, again, maybe start the night with drinking just a little bit, get a lot of energy. The more someone drinks, becomes a sedative. They may get tired, fall asleep. And then while you're sleeping, alcohol has continued to be metabolized or broken down in the body. And so then eventually it goes back to those low levels and becomes a stimulant again, as the body is metabolizing and getting rid of the alcohol. And so people will report after drinking, they might fall asleep because they're very tired. It's a sedative after a long night of drinking. But then in the middle of the night, they wake up. They report not being able to sleep. It's because the body is starting to metabolize the alcohol and it's back to a lower dose and becomes a stimulant again. Alcohol acts on GABA receptors and the dopamine receptors, which are part of our reward system in the brain. Alcohol interferes with cognitive and motor functioning as well as judgment. It's involved in more than 50% of car accidents, linked with violent crime. Alcohol reduces anxiety. We find that normally inhibits aggression. So typically we have some amount of anxiety that keeps us from doing things we shouldn't do, maybe from saying things we shouldn't say or acting in an aggressive way, even though we might be annoyed or frustrated in some situation. But when somebody drinks alcohol, that anxiety goes away and people are more apt to act on their aggressive impulses, to say things kind of aggressively that they wouldn't typically say, or to act out physically in an aggressive way that they typically wouldn't. Health dangers of alcohol. Well, all depressants have the potential to shut down the brainstem, resulting in coma or death. So we have that issue with alcohol. People drink a lot of alcohol. It slows down the central nervous system functioning and has the potential to basically shut down the brainstem. The brainstem is responsible for keeping your heart beating and keeping you breathing. So that's very dangerous. Chronic alcoholism may lead to cirrhosis of the liver and a vitamin B deficiency from very heavy long-term. Alcoholism can lead to brain damage and Korsakoff syndrome, that memory, which is severe memory loss. When someone is going through alcohol withdrawal, they can have tremors, anxiety, and mood disorders. They can also have something called delirium tremens, often after someone's a very heavy drinker and they try to stop cold turkey, basically, having that can lead to hallucinations, delusions, confusion, seizures, and even death. And so, if someone's a very heavy drinker, it's recommended that they try to stop drinking under medical supervision. A doctor may be there or administer some other medications to help them go through this withdrawal process because it can be very dangerous. And alcohol is more costly to society, considering all of these issues, than any other illegal drug. Alcohol inhibits the release of glutamate. Glutamate's an excitatory neurotransmitter, so if it inhibits the release of glutamate, then you have the sedating effect. Alcohol also increases the release of GABA. GABA is inhibitory, and so again, we kind of have both of these sedating and kind of stimulating effects. Fetal alcohol syndrome is another potential danger of drinking, and this is when a pregnant woman abuses alcohol, can lead to permanent damage to the fetus. And you can see this is a MRI image of a healthy infant and an infant with fetal alcohol syndrome. The corpus callosum that's typically there that connects the two hemispheres is pretty much non-existent, and you can see that not only is the brain fairly abnormal, so are the facial features and all different characteristics and deformities of the head and face. In adults, alcohol abuse affects frontal lobes, though the effects are reversible with abstinence. Binge drinking may cause brain damage and reduces the rate of neurogenesis. All right, hallucinogenic drugs, we'll talk about LSD first, but hallucinogenic drugs alter sensory perception and produce unusual experiences through all different neural actions. They cause perceptual distortions, light, color, detail. Objects can change shape. Sounds might sound different, evoke visual experiences. Many hallucinogenic drugs resemble serotonin in their molecular shape. So the other drugs up until now we talked about typically work on the dopamine system, the reward system, but the hallucinogenic drugs work on the serotonin system. They stimulate serotonin receptors at inappropriate times or for a longer duration than usual, thus causing their subjective effect. So LSD or acid strongly activates serotonin receptors in the visual cortex. LSD produces mood changes, feelings of creativity. It's even been tied to try to help some psychiatric conditions. But again, LSD working on the serotonin system. And MDMA or ecstasy is another hallucinogenic amphetamine derivative. It stimulates the visual cortical serotonin receptors as well, but also changes levels of dopamine. MDMA can lead to long-term depletion of serotonin in the brain, and if serotonin is really important for mood, so long-term ecstasy use can cause mood and cognitive performance problems and long-lasting changes in brain activation patterns. So it's a dangerous drug that often doesn't get the, people don't feel is so potentially damaging. So addiction is defined as a substance use disorder, can take multiple forms depending on substances from caffeine to alcohol to amphetamines or cocaine. Varies from mild to severe. So you can have a mild substance use disorder or severe. And the diagnosis of a substance use disorder will require sustained problems and patterns that interfere with daily functioning. So I'm not sure if you've taken an abnormal psychology class, but if you have, we use the uh, DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. This is the 5th edition that has all the criteria for psychiatric and psychological disorders that we use. And each disorder has criteria in order to be diagnosed with a particular disorder, whether it be schizophrenia or depression or substance use. And so in this case, this is the criteria for alcohol use disorder. So if someone were to have that um, get that diagnosis, they have to have a problematic pattern of alcohol use leading to clinically significant impairment or distress, with at least 2 of the following occurring within a 12-month period. And you could look through alcohols taken in larger amounts or over a longer period than was intended. There's a persistent desire or unsuccessful efforts to cut down or control alcohol use. A great deal of time is spent in activities necessary to obtain alcohol, cravings, etc. And depending on how many of these symptoms someone has, will let us know if we have a mild diagnosis or severe diagnosis. And then depending on the drug, this could be, you could take alcohol out and put in cocaine as for cocaine use disorder, be the same kind of criteria, but we're looking at a different drug, or nicotine, or whatever it is that the person is struggling with. There are 4 major models of drug abuse. The moral model, that the abuser lacks the moral character or lacks self-control. The disease model, that the abuser requires medical treatment because addiction and drug abuse is like a disease. The physical dependence model, that abusers use drugs to avoid withdrawal symptoms, and so they're dependent on those drugs. And the positive reward model, that the drug is a behavior controlled by positive rewards. Many addictive drugs cause dopamine release in the area of the brain called the nucleus accumbens. This is key. So drugs of addiction cause dopamine release in the nucleus accumbens. This is really what we call the reward center of the brain. Some axons that terminate here originate in the ventral tegmental area and are involved in the reward pathway. The addictive power of drugs may come from stimulating this pathway. So again, we've got this ventral tegmental area. Here's this nucleus accumbens. And these are really dopamine neurons. When the dopamine stimulates this nucleus accumbens, we see reward. It's very pleasurable. And many things will stimulate dopamine release in the nucleus accumbens. Lots of pleasurable things: sex, shopping, exercise, games, gambling, and drugs of abuse. All of them kind of or will activate this reward pathway from the ventral tegmental area. There's some amygdala and then this nucleus accumbens, and dopamine seems to be the key neurotransmitter. Another pathway may involve the insula, a brain region in the frontal cortex. People with damage to the insula have been able to stop smoking much easier, so maybe that reward is not as strong because of the damage there. Like I said, virtually all abused drugs increase dopamine levels in the nucleus accumbens. Rats who are given drugs that block dopamine don't learn to press a lever for cocaine. So there are quite a number of studies where they have rats who learn to press a lever to get some kind of a drug. This could be cocaine or anything. Here we have, and it doesn't say what we've got, but some drug like cocaine or methamphetamine. And rats will typically press this lever quite a bit to get the pleasurable reward and euphoric feeling of whatever drug it is. But if rats are given drugs that block dopamine, and we think dopamine is what's important in the release in the reward pathway, they don't learn to press that lever for cocaine. It's not rewarding anymore, so that makes us think dopamine is pretty important in the reward system. Human studies show people who showed the greatest increase in dopamine after drug use in the nucleus accumbens, reported the greatest high feeling. Animals will ignore food and water and tolerate a painful shock if we stimulate their nucleus accumbens by pressing a lever over 1,000 times an hour. So if we kind of skipped this syringe into the body, but just went directly to just electrically stimulating the nucleus accumbens. So it's no drug, it's just a direct electrical stimulation of the nucleus accumbens. Rats will press a lever to get that to happen. And we know that people will sacrifice their careers, relationships, and their lives basically to use drugs. It seems to be there's a very powerful reward system. What happens is that, and what's the problem or the difficulty with drugs of abuse, is that other pleasurable things like food and sex increase dopamine about 50 to 100% in the nucleus accumbens. So you do get a very big dopamine response when you're doing something pleasurable. However, using drugs to stimulate the nucleus accumbens here can have a 3 to 6-fold greater effect in terms of dopamine release. And so they're even more pleasurable than anything you would do naturally. And then when you try to stop using drugs and do things that were pleasurable before, like eating something delicious, that seems very unexciting after you've had that huge rush of dopamine from a drug. We'll talk about drugs used for treatment of psychological disorders when we get to those disorders. All right, thank you very much.